On the morning of September 14, 1983, civil engineer David Mercer stood on the cracked concrete crest of an aging reservoir in western Colorado, watching something almost no one ever gets to witness: a lake disappearing in real time. For weeks, the outlet valves buried in the base of the dam had been releasing millions of gallons an hour. Day by day, the shoreline pulled back from the surrounding hills, exposing pale bands of rock that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Officially, the reasoning was unremarkable. Inspectors had flagged sediment buildup and aging underwater intake structures, and a dry summer made it a convenient time to address both. Regional papers ran the story exactly as the state described it: routine maintenance, nothing more. That held true right up until the bottom of the reservoir actually started to emerge. First came hundreds of dead tree trunks, blackened limbs reaching up out of the mud like something trying to climb out. Then an old dirt road appeared, tracing a path across the exposed lakebed before vanishing again under silt. Within days, residents were gathering at the shoreline, pointing out shapes the drought years before had never uncovered. Straight-edged foundations, stretches of stone wall, fragments of masonry that didn't belong to anything on a modern map. Then, without warning, construction crews working the northern shoreline stopped. The next morning, sheriff's deputies had barriers up across the access roads into that one section of the basin. Survey vehicles arrived, state personnel moved in. Everywhere else along the exposed lakebed, visitors could walk right up and look. Only the northern section was sealed off, and nobody explained why, not in the newspapers, not in the engineering reports that followed. By that winter, the maintenance work was done. Snowmelt brought the water back. Within months, the whole landscape was underwater again, and most people simply forgot the operation had happened at all, except for the people who'd seen what came up out of the mud, and a small number of engineers whose field notes, once you go looking for them now, turn out to be surprisingly hard to find. If the only reason for draining that reservoir was drought and maintenance, why did one part of what surfaced get treated so differently from everything else? That question has sat quietly for more than 4 decades, and it's where this story actually starts. On its face, none of this should be unusual. Reservoirs across the American West get drawn down constantly for repairs and sediment removal, and when the water drops, history tends to resurface with it. Old bridges, abandoned farmhouses, railroad grades, cemeteries, sometimes entire communities that were flooded out decades earlier to make room for the lake. Engineers document it. Archaeologists catalog it. The local paper runs a few nostalgic photos before the water comes back and covers it all again. The Colorado case should have followed that exact pattern. Instead, it left behind missing paperwork, a handful of contradictory statements, and one question that no official report ever seems willing to touch directly. To understand why, you have to go back to long before the dam existed at all, back when the valley was still just a valley. A river once wound through that basin, bordered by sandstone ridges and cottonwood groves, with a scatter of small ranches connected by wagon roads to nearby mining towns. Prospectors moved through in the late 1800s chasing silver and, later, uranium. Most passed through and left. A few stayed, and a handful of those left journals mentioning stone ruins out past the edge of any settlement they recognized. Observations that, at the time, attracted no real attention. The West was full of abandoned cabins and weathered foundations. A few isolated ruins on a county survey map weren't considered remarkable. That changed after the war. Post-war population growth across the Southwest created enormous demand for water storage, and this particular valley was identified as ideal for a new reservoir. Engineers liked the geography. Environmental reviews focused on wildlife and relocation costs. Landowners were compensated, roads were rerouted, and buildings slated for demolition were documented ahead of construction. That was the plan, at least. As excavation began ahead of the dam, archaeological survey teams moved through the valley, and most of their work was entirely routine. Homesteads photographed, irrigation systems mapped, scattered artifacts cataloged under federal preservation law. Nearly all of that material is publicly available today, but a few lines stand out from the rest. One preliminary survey mentions, almost in passing, stone alignments of uncertain origin near the northern edge of the future reservoir. No follow-up, no interpretation. A separate engineering memo recommends delaying excavation in that same sector pending additional historical evaluation. That recommendation simply disappears from every report that comes after it. Construction proceeds without comment. On their own, omissions like that mean very little. Big infrastructure projects bury thousands of small observations under budgets and logistics every year. It's only when the same pattern keeps resurfacing decades apart that it starts to look less like bureaucratic noise and more like a thread someone's been quietly avoiding. During the reservoir's initial filling, the local paper ran a brief interview with a rancher whose family had worked that valley for generations. He gave the reporter exactly 2 sentences. They flooded more than farms. There were places people stopped talking about long before the water came. Nobody followed up. No second article ran. The line just sat there, unexplained, for the next 40 years. Decades later, a second clue turned up by accident in a stack of aerial photographs digitized for a regional mapping project. Comparing early construction images to ones taken only weeks afterward, researchers noticed several rectangular stone features near the northern shoreline that simply weren't there anymore. Ordinary enough in theory, demolition crews routinely cleared structures ahead of flooding, except the engineering logs that documented every road removal, every bridge teardown, every stretch of utility relocation had nothing on record for that specific site. The work happened. The paperwork for it didn't. Then, in 1996, a retired equipment operator named Harold Jensen sat for an oral history interview about the dam's original construction. Most of it was the kind of thing you'd expect: rock slides, concrete pours, weather delays. Near the end, almost as an aside, he mentioned something he said he'd never brought up before. His crew had been pulled off one isolated section of the valley for a few days after surveyors asked for extra time there. No one told them why. When they came back, part of the area had been fenced off and the fencing was gone again before the reservoir ever filled. What stuck with Jensen 40 years later wasn't what he'd seen. It was what he'd been kept from seeing. That section, as it turned out, sat in almost the exact same spot that would be cordoned off again in 1983, which meant whatever drew attention after the reservoir was drained had apparently drawn the same kind of attention before it was ever filled in the first place. By the spring of 1983, the reservoir had been full for nearly 30 years. Fishermen crossed water that hid old ranch roads. Whole generations had grown up assuming the lake had simply always been there. Then state engineers announced a drawdown well beyond anything normal maintenance required, framed in the same practical language as always: sediment removal, intake inspection, structural assessment, with the ongoing drought offering a convenient extra justification. Almost no one questioned it. But the internal schedules tell a slightly different story. The maintenance work, as originally planned, called for a modest reduction in elevation. The revised plan authorized a drawdown deep enough to expose ground that hadn't seen daylight since the reservoir first filled. And the paperwork never explains why the scope changed. As the water kept retreating past where anyone expected it to stop, survey crews moved into ground that had been underwater for 30 years. Mercer, the engineer supervising the structural inspection, kept detailed field notes, mostly concrete conditions and erosion patterns, the usual. Then, partway through one notebook, the subject shifts. He describes exposed stone features extending beyond mapped limits. 3 words do all the work in that sentence: beyond mapped limits. Engineers already had the original construction surveys listing every structure cleared before the valley flooded. If what Mercer was looking at wasn't on those maps, then either the original survey had missed something, or whatever he was standing in front of had never been recorded at all. Within days, the personnel on site changed. Vehicle logs show archaeologists from a regional cultural resources office, 2 historic preservation specialists, and survey teams hauling in equipment you don't normally need for dam maintenance: transit instruments, precision cameras, ground markers. Residents watching from the shore noticed the shift immediately. One recalled officials working around a cluster of low stone walls rising out of the mud. Another remembered tarps going up before any photography started. Neither detail proves anything by itself. Archaeological teams use tarps to control light and protect fragile material all the time. but both accounts point to the same isolated stretch of shoreline that would shortly become off-limits to the public, officially because of unstable sediment that could trap a vehicle or a person. That explanation held up right until people started comparing photographs of the restricted boundary against the actual ground conditions. The fencing didn't follow the softest mud. It followed the stone. If unstable ground were the real concern, the safety perimeter should have tracked the geology. Instead, it tracked a specific cluster of structures, which is a strange coincidence for a safety decision to make. That discrepancy is what eventually pulled in amateur historians from nearby towns, several of whom had copies of 19th century land surveys from the county archive. They expected to match the new ruins to some old ranch or mining camp. Nothing matched. The foundations inside the restricted zone didn't appear on any settlement map anyone could find. And a geological assessment from before the dam was even built, listing every cabin, barn, bridge, and fenced pasture slated for demolition, didn't mention them either. None of that proves the structures were ancient or strange or anything in particular. It proves something narrower and, in its own way, more interesting. Whatever those foundations were, they had slipped through the documentation process from the very beginning. The clearest hint of what investigators were actually looking at came from one of the archaeologists who worked the 1983 site. She never gave an interview, but personal correspondence she donated to a university archive years later survives. And one line in it has been quoted more than almost anything else connected to this case. She describes architectural remains inconsistent with expected agricultural occupation. The sentence just ends there. No elaboration follows it anywhere in the collection. Agricultural sites tend to leave a recognizable signature: farmhouses, storage buildings, corrals, irrigation works. If what she was looking at didn't read as agricultural, the obvious question is what it read as instead. Her letters never say. That single unfinished sentence has become, for researchers who've spent years on this case, the closest thing to a direct description of what actually came out of the ground that fall. The paper trail only gets stranger from there. Survey aircraft photographed most of the exposed lakebed during the drawdown, and most of those images are public record today, except for a run of frames covering the center of the northern site, which simply aren't in the file. The shots taken right before and right after that stretch are intact. The middle is gone. Archivists are quick to point out the ordinary explanations: damaged film, camera malfunction, images that failed quality control. All plausible. What's harder to explain away is that the missing frames line up almost exactly with the same patch of ground that was fenced off on the ground at the same time. Local newspaper coverage shifted the same way. The first week of the drawdown produced exactly the kind of nostalgic photo spread you'd expect: old roads, rusted equipment, the bones of the original valley. Then, abruptly, coverage narrowed to the engineering work at the dam itself, and the northern site stopped appearing in print almost entirely. No editor ever explained the change. Residents near the reservoir noticed activity that never made it into any official account either. Truck traffic increased after dark. Floodlights ran through the night over the restricted basin with no announced nighttime work to explain them. Retired Deputy Alan Brooks, assigned to patrol one of the access roads, said his instructions were simple: keep people out, don't ask questions. He never went into the restricted area himself, but he remembered the people coming and going from it didn't all look like engineers. Some wore field gear more suited to an archaeological dig than a construction site. Some carried document cases instead of tools. None of this, taken individually, proves anything extraordinary happened. Large infrastructure projects pull in specialists from a dozen disciplines as a matter of course. But stacked together, the incomplete maps, the unexplained field notes, the archaeologist's unfinished sentence, the missing film, the fenced perimeter that followed stone instead of mud, a more complicated picture starts to take shape than routine maintenance can fully account for. Then there's the memo that, more than any single piece of testimony, has kept this story alive. A one-line authorization extending the drawdown schedule to allow for, in its exact wording, completion of site documentation before re-impoundment. Not repairs, not inspections. Site documentation. No appendix names the site. No final report describing what that documentation contained has ever surfaced publicly. Whatever was recorded during those extra days is, as far as anyone has been able to determine, simply gone. The deeper this gets investigated, the clearer it becomes that the real mystery was never under the water at all. It's inside the filing system. Most of what you'd expect from a project this size still exists. The structural inspection files survived intact. Hydrological data is still on request. Sediment analyses, maintenance contracts, the routine paperwork of running a dam, all there. It's only the material touching that one stretch of shoreline that thins out again and again at exactly the point where it should be getting more detailed instead of less. Reports reference archaeological evaluations that were never attached. File inventories list photographs no longer in the folder. Meeting minutes cite recommendations whose supporting documents simply aren't anywhere in the collection. One archivist who worked with independent researchers on this case put it about as well as anyone has. It's like following footprints that suddenly stop. The trail doesn't vanish all at once. It just goes patchy over and over at precisely the moments where the most useful information should be. Buried inside a state preservation index compiled years after the drawdown is a catalog entry for something called only Site C27. No location, no photographs, no summary, just a note confirming documentation had been completed before the reservoir went back into service. No complete file matching that number has ever turned up. Whether it was renumbered, transferred, or simply lost in some later reorganization, nobody has been able to say. It survives today as little more than the outline of a document that clearly existed once and doesn't anymore. Modern satellite imagery has added one more layer to the puzzle. During years of exceptionally low water since, faint geometric outlines have occasionally shown up in the basin before vanishing again as levels rise. Some resembling old roadbeds, others too regular looking to dismiss outright as natural fracture patterns or sediment drift, though experts are right to note that both can convincingly fake the appearance of a foundation from above. None of it proves a hidden structure. All of it suggests the northern basin still has more to say whenever the water lets it. None of this is unique to one reservoir in Colorado either. Across the West, falling water levels have repeatedly handed back ghost towns, historic bridges, and indigenous sites that everyone assumed were gone for good. A reminder that a lot of these reservoirs were filled before modern archaeological standards required the kind of documentation we'd expect today. Whole chapters of regional history went under the water with only the barest record of what was there. Seen that way, this case stops looking like an isolated mystery and starts looking like a single sharp example of something that happened constantly. Infrastructure moving faster than the people trying to study what stood in its way. Sites nobody thought twice about in one decade turn out to matter enormously in the next. And by then, the only people who remember are retired equipment operators and county clerks holding folders nobody's opened in 40 years. It's possible the most ordinary explanation is also the true one, that the restricted area held a genuinely undocumented settlement, that the access limits and the rushed documentation reflect nothing more than responsible archaeology working against a hard deadline before the water came back. If so, none of it needed to be secret. It just needed to be finished, written up, and filed somewhere people could find it. But that explanation still has to answer for why the documentation it depends on can't be located, why surveys are referenced without their conclusions attached, why the photographic record breaks exactly where the story gets interesting. None of that proves concealment. It proves uncertainty, and uncertainty, more often than people expect, is where the real history actually lives. Former state employees asked about the project over the years mostly remember very little: routine maintenance, archaeologists near some old ruins, nothing dramatic. No one describes an extraordinary find. No one claims a cover-up. That ordinariness matters. Genuine historical loose ends rarely look like conspiracy theories. They look exactly like this: incomplete files, missing context, nothing that rises to the level of an explosive secret, and nothing that fully closes the question either. Maybe the most telling part of this whole case is what was never said. No agency ever issued a denial, because no one ever made a claim large enough to need denying. No press conference dismissed any rumors. because officially there was nothing to dismiss. The drawdown finished. The reservoir refilled. Life went on until, decades later, scattered fragments from old notebooks, donated letters, and oral history tapes started lining up into something that looked, for the first time, like the outline of a story nobody had ever told all the way through. That's usually how this kind of history survives, when it survives at all, not as one clean revelation, but as a pile of small inconsistencies that simply refuse to cancel each other out. A line in a memo, a missing photograph, a catalog number with nothing behind it, a delay nobody explained, a notebook entry about foundations beyond the mapped limits, a retired worker who still remembers a fence that went up overnight and came down just as quietly. None of those things, on its own, rewrites the story of that valley. Together, they leave behind a harder question. What if the most important discoveries made during that drawdown were never meant to vanish from the record? Not because they were dangerous, but simply because the investigation behind them never got finished. History is full of exactly that kind of loose end. Digs cut short by funding. Reports shelved when priorities moved on. Evidence that doesn't get destroyed so much as quietly set down and forgotten in a box nobody thinks to search. That may be exactly what happened here. An investigation frozen mid-sentence and then sealed back under the surface. Or the structures were documented correctly the first time and folded into records that simply never drew public attention, which is its own kind of mundane, and arguably just as easy to believe. The truth, whichever it is probably far less sensational than the version people want to tell around it. It may also matter more, precisely because it isn't about a hidden civilization or a government cover-up. It's about how easily a piece of real history disappears the moment a landscape changes faster than anyone can study it. When a road becomes a riverbed, a homestead becomes a lakebed, and the record that should have followed it down simply doesn't. Stand at the edge of that reservoir today, and there's nothing to see. The water sits flat and calm. Boats cross the same surface that buried the whole valley decades ago. Nothing on that shoreline hints that old roads, forgotten foundations, and a handful of ruins surfaced briefly in 1983 before the lake closed back over them. Somewhere below the surface, the northern basin is still exactly where it's always been, holding whatever it's holding, while the documents that might explain it sit incomplete. The photographs sit fragmented, and the question that started all of this sits exactly where it was left 40 years ago. If the reservoir was only ever drained for drought and maintenance, why did so much of what came up with the water disappear almost as completely as the valley itself? The answer, if it still exists anywhere, probably isn't under the water at all. It's more likely sitting in an uncatalogued box in an archive nobody's opened in decades, waiting for someone willing to pick the investigation back up exactly where it was quietly left off.